lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
A single choice made behind palace walls has sent shockwaves across royal history, turning Prince Harry's once quiet murmurs about money into a terrifying reality. According to sources, Meghan's most recent action caused an unanticipated inheritance freeze, which forced Prince William to come forward and confirm something even more disturbing. As the monarchy approaches one of its most perilous turning points to date, Princess Diana herself is said to have foreseen a future similar to this one long ago. This raises the issue of whether what we are seeing now is coincidence, meticulous planning, or fate. Prince Harry's inheritance from his late mother has been formally blocked in an extraordinary decision that has had an impact on the royal family and beyond. Delivered with legal authority and accuracy, this revelation was not a reaction to lingering personal grievances, tabloid hysteria, or rumors. Rather, it was a conscious choice made by the palace based on custom, legislation, and the preservation of Princess Diana's meticulously crafted legacy. Senior Clarence House officials discreetly approved the immediate suspension of all payouts from the trust associated with the Duke of Sussex and his dependents before sunrise on January 17, 2026. The motivation behind this deed is what makes it exceptional. A long-dormant clause in Princess Diana's trust has been activated for the first time in history. This clause, which was created expressly to protect the integrity of her lineage, was brought about by recent events purportedly connected to Meghan Markle. These events raised unanswered concerns regarding the beneficiary's ancestry and their eligibility under the conditions Diana herself established decades ago. Palace sources claim that the decision was made due to legal necessity rather than scandal or conjecture. There was no opportunity for misunderstanding in an official declaration made under Prince William's authority. The action was clearly not a punishment aimed at Harry, Meghan, or anybody else, but rather a preventive measure meant to preserve the estate and honor Diana's desires. However, the ramifications are profound in the language of royalty. When this provision is activated, it indicates that the problem is a structural issue affecting the monarchy's core foundations and the continuation of Diana's legacy rather than a small dispute to be handled behind closed doors. The clause itself is clear and uncompromising, according to royal watchers. It only considers biological and legal clarity, not behavior, reputation, or public opinion. No inheritance can be released, no trusts can be distributed, and no entitlement assumptions can be made until these emergent issues are fully settled. The House of Windsor's approach to succession, transparency, and the preservation of its most treasured legacies may change as a result of what formerly seemed to be a private family matter. Prince Harry's inheritance being frozen represents a rare instance of power in the contemporary monarchy. It serves as a sobering reminder that custom, the law, and foresight can still interact in ways that drastically alter people's lives. The trust has been established, the palace has spoken, and the questions remain unanswered. What will be revealed from the shadows of the past, and how will the Duke of Sussex react? Princess Diana's sealed trust has an esoteric legal process called Clause 3, which is at the heart of this debate. This provision was never meant to control behavior or handle scandals. Its only goal is to guarantee bloodline certainty by limiting access to the trust in cases where biological heritage from Diana's sons cannot be confirmed beyond a reasonable doubt. Clause 3, a precaution never anticipated to be needed, lay dormant for decades. A warning that was once subtly incorporated into legislative wording seems to have now come to pass with its abrupt activation. Clause 3 was long seen by palace attorneys as a severe contingency rather than an active precaution, and it was formerly thought to be neglected and nearly forgotten. Now, its activation represents a significant turning point in history. Prince William has essentially admitted that Princess Diana's previously disregarded worry was a purposeful legal safeguard created especially for a situation like this, rather than poetic terror or emotional intuition, by permitting the clause to be enforced. Since then, royal archivists have verified that Diana herself insisted on the clause's inclusion in the middle of the 1990s, when her faith in royal institutions had begun to decline but her maternal instincts were becoming more acute. Diana allegedly worried at the time that her youngest son would one day be susceptible to uncertainty brought on by silence, concealment, and unresolved questions rather than brutality or betrayal. She was concerned that if the truth was kept hidden long enough, it might turn into a weapon without ever being used on purpose. Clause 3 was discreetly classified as maternal foresight at the time of the trust's finalization, a nervous but reasonable request from a mother under extreme stress. Nobody anticipated its usage. Nobody anticipated that what was thought to be a birthright would require biological verification in the future. The time has come for that future. William has made Diana's private warning legally binding by activating the clause. The trust makes no accusations, conjectures, or suggestions regarding misconduct. It just pauses. Before moving forward, it requires confirmation. Access to the inheritance is suspended, untouched, immovable, and protected, until that confirmation is obtained. The freeze is a legal breath held in anticipation of clarification rather than a punishment. However, it has significant ramifications. Once a confidential document of protection, it now serves as a public warning that long-avoidable questions cannot be postponed. William has opted for structure over quiet and certainty over sentiment in upholding Clause 3. He has permitted his mother's subdued anxiety to emerge and function precisely as she had planned. The inheritance is locked until the truth is officially confirmed. It is protected not by suspicion but by a clause that was penned decades ago by a mother who decided that the truth will eventually matter. It serves as a reminder that, even in the life of a royal, unanswered questions never go away, and that legacies are passed down not only through wealth but also through the bravery to face the unresolved issues of history. The freezing of Prince Harry's inheritance was made possible by the revelation of Clause 3, but it also brings up more important issues. How does the law interpret Diana's acts, and why would the royal family trigger such a clause now? One must examine the extraordinary power that English law gave Princess Diana to mold her legacy in order to comprehend this. She had the legal right to specify who would inherit her estate, under what conditions, and on what terms in accordance with the testamentary freedom concept. There are very few legal restrictions on such decisions in England and Wales. English law permits a will to represent the maker's intentions with little intervention, in contrast to Scotland, where close family members are granted a share of an estate regardless of the deceased's preferences. For Diana, this meant that her estate served as a carefully crafted weapon to safeguard her intentions long after her passing, rather than just being a financial asset. If the situation called for it, she had every right to set restrictions, demand confirmation, postpone disbursements, or stop inheritance entirely. This area of legal flexibility gave rise to Clause 3. It was a legitimate system that was precisely and foresightly written, neither radical nor unsuitable. Clauses that postpone inheritance until beneficiaries attain a given age or fulfill particular requirements are found in many trusts. Diana's clause only addressed lineage certainty, which is entirely legal. Its goal, not its legality, is what makes it remarkable. Diana thought that inheritance ought to be based on reality rather than conjecture. In order to ensure clarity prior to access, the clause was intended to slow things down rather than to accuse or condemn. Clause 3 was purely Diana's choice, not anything her advisors or royal attorneys imposed. Each phrase was carefully chosen to protect rather than to provoke. She used the authority granted to her by English law to carefully, resolutely, and strategically shape her legacy. However, the law did not serve as the ultimate impetus. Something much more intimate, a letter written by Diana herself, was what finally forced the Crown to take action. Her former butler, Paul Burrell, wrote the letter in the summer of 1996 and kept it secret for decades. It came to light following an exceptionally thorough examination of royal inheritances. Everything changed when it reappeared. Diana wrote as a mother who sensed difficulties ahead rather than as a princess. Intuition rather than accusation pervaded the tone, which was serene but anxious. She talked of shielding her sons from complexity, concealment, and hidden truths rather than from adversaries. Diana cautioned in the letter that charm might conceal doubt and that quiet might eventually be more damaging than lying. She even talked about an incident she had with a blind Tibetan mystic while on humanitarian trips, which stuck with her and strengthened her belief that unresolved issues had a tendency to come up again. That warning seems to be more than theoretical now, decades later. It is now the silent force behind one of the most important choices the monarchy has had to make in many generations. The encounter was short but incredibly disturbing. Diana claims that the mystic spoke gently of futures created by covert divisions, of bloodlines being subtly torn apart, of crowns being weakened from within rather than from without, and of truth being postponed until harm had already been done. Delivered with such serene politeness that it persisted long after the interaction was over, the warning was mild rather than spectacular. Diana later acknowledged that she didn't fully comprehend the message at the time, but she felt obligated to capture it because she thought its significance might eventually become apparent. Diana wrote a brief poem in her own meticulous style at the conclusion of her letter. It was disregarded for years as contemplative poetry, the type of symbolic writing she frequently employed to deal with doubt, hope, and dread. Nobody thought it was meant to direct legislation or policy. Now, that presumption is no longer valid. Decades later, legal scholars re-examined the letter and discovered that the symbolic language of Clause 3 nearly exactly replicated the verse. What used to sound poetic now reads like instructions, with each line emphasizing verification, delay, and the idea that sometimes the truth needs to be protected until it is ready to be revealed. According to the letter, Diana had been planning rather than speculating. She realized that the most harmful threats might come silently, cloaked in grace and good intentions, rather than loudly and cruelly. Her fear was not scandal but rather a legacy of uncertainty. Clause 3 could no longer be regarded by the Crown as a symbolic gesture if the letter was verified and officially accepted. Diana had imagined a time when the truth would not come to light on its own, but would instead lie dormant until someone had the courage to bring it to light. Now that the time has come, a private letter has become a silent power that is changing history, responsibility, and the meaning of inheritance in the royal narrative. Beyond Clause 3 of her will, however, Diana's written words prompted another query. What makes this clause relevant now, and may Meghan be connected to Diana's greatest fear? In order to comprehend that, focus shifted to a single, surprising assertion that triggered a dormant defense. Someone no one had expected was at the center of the developing catastrophe. She was a 29-year-old American lady known only as AM in court documents. She was neither a royal nor a court advisor or a prominent member of the media. Her name had never before been mentioned in public discourse or palace records, but her composed arrival subtly changed everything. AM didn't show up in a fit of rage or spectacle. She was deliberate, exact, and measured. She made the startling claim that she was Meghan Markle's biological daughter in this story. Her declared birth date of July 1996 put her at a critical juncture in history, and the dates by themselves demanded attention. It was detail, not drama, that made her presence unavoidable. She produced signed declarations, notarized documents, and meticulously prepared paperwork, including DNA test results that showed a 99% maternal match to the Markle family line and were examined by a renowned geneticist worldwide. Remarkably, AM didn't request any of the things that usually lead to these kinds of admissions. She didn't want money, titles, privileges, or attention from the public. Neither inheritance nor an apology were demanded. Her goal was limited and very personal: access to authentic medical history and recognition of the reality. She didn't want money, she wanted clarity. Her claim was seen differently as a result of such restraint. It was difficult for officials to write her off as careless or opportunistic. Her tone was calm, her vocabulary was cautious, and her emphasis was on certainty rather than identity, on understanding one's origins and the implications for history, health, and integrity. The moment she showed up turned out to be crucial. It happened at the same time as legal reviews pertaining to dormant protections within royal trusts were reopened. The incident crossed an unseen line the instant AM moved forward. Once hypothetical questions become urgent, doubt evolved into a formal procedure. It was impossible to remain silent. Clause 3, which had been unaltered for a long time, could no longer sleep. Clause 3, which had long been thought of as a purely theoretical safeguard, could no longer be ignored. When concerns about ancestry arose, its goal was to wait and confirm rather than to pass judgment or make accusations. Regardless of whether AM's claim was ultimately accepted or denied, its mere existence triggered that procedure. Precision, not scandal, was the source of the catastrophe. With documentation instead of demands, one person made a tradition-based system face uncertainty. The fact that truth, in whatever form it could take, had been formally invited into the room was more important at that point than the outcome. There was no going back to ignorance after the invitation was sent. By definition, Clause 3 applied to the emergence of AM and a claim that had not yet been convincingly refuted. Questions were inevitably raised by this. Would her claim be further investigated, or was the palace responding more on instinct than logic? In order to respond to that, focus shifted backward to a past that had never been thoroughly investigated. A worrisome timeline gradually surfaced as investigators in this fictional narrative started piecing together historical fragments. It was a series of subtle details that, when combined, raised grave procedural issues rather than a single shocking revelation. The implication of a covert Catholic engagement and potential short-lived marriage between Meghan Markle and Joe Giuliano in the mid-1990s was at the heart of this reconstruction. Such assertions were merely rumors for many years. They were now regarded as records in the story that needed to be verified. It was stated that the interaction took place during a formative stage of life, far before any royal tie. Investigators were not troubled by the relationship per se, but rather by what seemed to follow: allusions to a sealed annulment request sent to Catholic authorities that mentioned an unbaptized kid. Vatican records that had previously been written off as rumors were brought back into focus inside this fictional framework. Even sealed annulments leave systematic traces since the Church is renowned for its careful procedures. Archivists were looking for accuracy rather than scandal. If confirmed, these documents would imply that important aspects of one's past have been kept secret for many years. Procedure was the problem, not morality or personal preference. When it comes to visa applications, marriage planning, and vetting, royal systems depend on complete openness. Even when there is no malevolent intent, omissions are seen as procedural violations. This distinction became crucial. Investigators were looking for completion rather than guilt. Silence may have the same repercussions as lying under royal law. All pertinent history is assumed to be on the table by institutions based on continuity and legitimacy. Systems intended for clarity become ambiguous if there is any less. Consequently, the consequences affected inheritance, titles, and even lineage itself, going beyond the past and into the present. Once thought to be well established, the Sussex line now seems susceptible to procedural review. Officials were more uneasy about what had never been investigated than about what could someday be confirmed. The chronology implied that gaps rather than lies had concealed the truth. Additionally, voids must be repaired as soon as they are identified. The inquiry did not make any accusations. It stopped. It recognized that when systems designed for certainty run into unresolved issues, even long-dormant history can resurface. Tradition, which was traditionally used as a safeguard, provided no defense against the need for explanations. Consequences emerged on two fronts when the monarchy went into what insiders secretly referred to as a legacy lockdown, a concerted attempt to protect succession and limit exposure. Every action inside the palace was controlled and methodical. Prince William severed relations without fanfare, but with clear authority when he ordered the suspension of all references, initiatives, and financial assets associated with the Sussex branch. Princess and ensured that no formal or informal ties remained active by freezing philanthropic engagements associated with the pair. Deliberate prudence was employed by Princess Catherine, whose quiet was deliberately chosen and quite deliberate. Windsor's message was clear. The monarchy's machinery would run smoothly. Distractions, exceptions, and shortcuts would all be eliminated. The change was less noticeable but just as significant on the other side of the Atlantic. Meghan Markle's once robust network of Hollywood friends started to deteriorate. Longtime allies withdrew from partnerships. Projects paused for no apparent reason. Releases were halted by media outlets. As influence subtly faded, what had previously been presented as resiliency and independence started to resemble solitude. Legal strategy surpassed narrative control in both realms. Once a shield, silence turned into a liability. In Windsor, procedure and moderation were used to maintain continuity. In a field that depends on visibility and momentum, being out of the spotlight in Los Angeles came with a price. Doors closed with a serene finality rather than drama or conflict. Behind the scenes, professional, social, and institutional channels changed, indicating that power without involvement eventually wanes and that uncertainty, once recognized, transforms everything it affects. Furthermore, visibility is limited without access. Hollywood's covert withdrawal and the monarchy's controlled containment came together to create an unsaid reality. Links break down, structures tighten, and silence, no matter how calculated, eventually has repercussions of its own. It was a striking contrast. An empire of tradition, strengthened by convention and discipline, stood on one side. Conversely, a world that relies on prominence and power is gradually losing its support. In both worlds, the quiet finality of doors kept closed, rather than dramatic declarations or public declarations, shaped the future. In reaction to Meghan's alleged conduct, industry allies withdrew, references and assets connected to Sussex were suspended, and philanthropic connections were frozen. But one question stood out above the others. What would happen to Prince Harry, and would the king intervene to save his son in this dire situation? The issue reached its institutional and emotional pinnacle by January 18th, a momentous occasion that will go down in royal history. With a calm determination, Prince Harry left Montecito without an entourage or spectacle. He only took legal documents, private letters, and, most poignantly, his mother Princess Diana's last will and testament, which served as a somber reminder of inheritance, expectations, and an incomplete legacy. Unresolved issues of duty, love, and ancestry were included in those meticulously preserved manuscripts. These issues now required resolution. Tension was high inside Buckingham Palace as the system went into exceptional mode. King Charles activated dormant rules intended to prevent the acknowledgement of descendants whose claims were unclear or contested, using legal powers seldom used. Although these systems had been around for centuries, they were rarely needed. They could no longer be avoided. Officials from the palace moved with deliberate accuracy. Every measure was made to preserve continuity and tradition, including consulting archives, authenticating letters, and adhering to protocols. Paul Burrell, Princess Diana's lifelong butler and confidant, moved forward to deliver her last sealed letter amid this controlled intensity. Diana had foreseen her youngest son's current predicament, the tug of love versus the burden of legacy, in its painstaking and intensely intimate language. Written in private correspondence decades ago, what had once appeared speculative had come to pass. Harry's long-anticipated reckoning was now inevitable. The Globe watched as King Charles spoke to the country later that evening. Sensationalism and controversy were absent from his address, which was serious and restrained. Instead, he talked about duty, stewardship, and the need for clarity. He said that without confirmation, there could be neither inheritance nor restoration. Despite being succinct, his remarks bore the weight of generations, reiterating that the monarchy endures not because of personal preference but rather because of strict devotion to the law, customs, and the prudent management of ancestry. The words, "Sometimes, to protect the crown, you must let go of the prince," reverberated down the corridors sculpted by years of royal history as the palace lights faded. It was said to acknowledge the harsh realities of responsibility rather than to pass judgment. The idea of smooth inheritance and fairy tale succession vanished at that instant. What came next was not spectacle, but reckoning, a painful and methodical process of confirmation and judgment. Now, lines of succession, families, and legacies will all be scrutinized under a harsh, clear lens. Truth, no matter how inconvenient, was essential to the monarchy's existence. The future was still unclear for Prince Harry. The message was clear to the crown. The path forward would henceforth be determined by history, law, and obligation. There would be no quick cuts. It was time for the reckoning. What do you think of Meghan's actions causing Prince Harry's inheritance to be frozen? Could they both make it through this stressful and uncertain time? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments section below.